The air hits me before the water does. Cold, absolute, the kind of cold that doesn't sting, it simply takes. I am falling, and the bridge is above me, and the river is below me, and in between, there is only the sound of wind and the particular silence of a decision already made. My family's voices have stopped. They stopped the moment my feet left the railing. I notice this the way I notice everything, clinically, with the part of my mind that never quite shuts off, even now, even here, and then something catches me, not the water, something warm. The cold open should have promised you survival. It does not. It promises something else entirely. Her name was Lena Vasile, and before the night she stepped off the Mirova Bridge, she had spent 23 years perfecting the art of not being seen. It was not a skill she had chosen. It had been constructed for her, layer by careful layer, by a family that found her most useful when she was quiet, most tolerable when she was small, most manageable when she asked for nothing and expected less. The Vasile family was a name in the city of Caldenmere, not powerful in the way that ancient things are powerful, but powerful in the way that money and connection and a carefully maintained reputation for generosity can make a family untouchable. They sat on the city's 3 governing councils. They endowed the hospital's East Wing. They had a box at the Winter Opera and a history of charitable donations, precisely calibrated to be visible. They also had Lena. She was the second daughter, the quiet one, the one who had been born without the gold that seemed to run through the rest of them, without her sister Mira's social ease, without her brother Caelan's easy confidence, without her mother's particular talent for making a room feel like it had been arranged specifically for her arrival. Lena was the girl who sat at the edge of family dinners and watched and said nothing and cleared the plates when no one was looking. She had a talent her family did not know about and would not have valued if they had. She could read a room the way other people read text, all at once, taking in not just the words but the weight of them, the gaps between them, the things being said by bodies and angles and the direction of eyes. She had developed this skill the way prey animals develop camouflage, because survival required it. She worked in the family's financial offices, filing, organizing, the kind of work that required precision and rewarded invisibility. She was very good at it. No one thanked her for being good at it. She had long since stopped expecting thanks, which was different from not wanting it. She was careful about that distinction in her own mind in the hours after midnight, when she was alone in her small room at the back of the family house and the performance of smallness could stop. She was just very practiced at not showing it. The night everything broke open began with her sister Mira's engagement dinner. It should have been background noise. Lena was used to being background noise. She had pressed her one good dress, arranged the flowers on the table, confirmed the reservation, and seated herself at the far end near the kitchen door, where she could leave quietly if the evening ran long. It was her brother Caelan who found the documents. She had not hidden them well. She knew that now. She had found them 3 weeks earlier, 6 pages of financial records, buried in a quarterly summary, representing transfers she did not recognize to accounts she could not trace, signed in her father's hand and co-signed by a man named Gregor Ilas, who sat on the city's second council alongside the Vasile patriarch. The transfers were small enough to be invisible in isolation. Across 7 years, they totaled something that was not small at all. She had not known what to do with what she found. She had made copies. She had put the copies in an envelope in her desk drawer and told herself she was still deciding. Caelan found the envelope. He showed it to their father. Their mother was called from the table. Mira stayed because Mira always stayed for things that interested her. And the sight of Lena standing in the hallway while her father held the envelope and looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, not anger, something colder than anger, interested Mira very much. You were going to take this somewhere. her father said. It was not a question. He was not asking. Her body registered the shift in the room before her mind did. A drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the weather, a tightening in her chest, her hands steadying themselves flat against her thighs the way they always did when she was frightened and could not afford to show it. I found them in the quarterly records, she said. I didn't know what they were. And you copied them? Yes. And kept them? Yes. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that had texture. Her brother was looking at the window. Her mother had her hands folded in a specific way that meant she had already decided what was going to happen. Her sister was watching Lena with an expression that was, if she was being precise, something close to satisfaction. You've always been a problem, her father said. It was delivered flatly as though it were a financial assessment. We have managed it. We will manage this. She understood then that she was not going to be allowed to leave the house that night. She understood it the way she understood most things in the Vasile household, not through words but through the physics of the room, the way everyone had positioned themselves, the fact that Calin was standing between her and the front door without appearing to do so deliberately. She walked to the back of the house instead, out through the kitchen, into the garden, over the back fence in the dark because she had known that fence since she was 7 and she knew exactly which boards had give. She walked 11 blocks to the Mirova Bridge, which spanned the cold river where it ran deepest and coldest through the center of the city. She walked because she did not know where else to go. She stood at the railing for a long time. The river below was black and fast and she was so tired. Not of living. She had never, even at her lowest, been tired of living. She was tired of performing smallness for people who had never once looked up to see if she was there. She stepped up onto the lower railing. She was not trying to die. She was trying to stop being visible to them. She let go. The air hit her, cold and absolute. And then something caught her. His hands were wrong. That was the first thing she noticed before she understood anything else about what was happening. She was falling and then she was not falling, and something had her, 2 hands, one at her back and one beneath her knees, and they were warm, not body warm, not the ordinary temperature of a living thing, something else, something deliberate, like warmth was a decision being made in real time rather than a fact of biology. She did not scream. Later, she would not be able to explain why she did not scream. Some part of her survival-trained mind registered that whatever had caught her was infinitely less dangerous than what she had left on the bridge above. She looked up. He was standing on the outside of the bridge railing, one hand gripping the stone, both feet on a lip of masonry no wider than her palm, holding her against his chest as though her weight cost him nothing. The light from the bridge lamps fell across one side of his face, dark hair, a jaw like something carved to make a point, eyes that caught the light wrong, not reflecting it the way human eyes do, but doing something else with it, something she didn't have language for. He was looking at her the way no one had ever looked at her, not with pity, not with alarm, with something that was almost recognition, which made no sense at all because she had never seen this man before in her life. The river would have killed you, he said. His voice had a cadence to it that was fractionally off, not the accent of any place she recognized, but something older than accent. The residue of a way of speaking that had been learned before the current century and never quite updated. She was aware of his pulse, or rather she was aware of the absence of it. Her hand was against his chest and there was no heartbeat. None, not slow, not faint, absent. I know, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer with that impossible attention. Then he stepped backward off the railing and set her down on the bridge walkway and released her and took one step back. And that step back cost him something. She could see that it did, though she couldn't have said how she could see it. Go somewhere safe, he said. I don't have anywhere. The statement landed in the air between them. She hadn't meant to say it. She hadn't meant to say anything. But she was standing on a bridge at midnight, with her hands still shaking from the cold, and a month's worth of carefully managed composure had just gone over the railing. And the truth had come out the way truths do, when all the structures maintaining them collapse at once. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. He was very still, the kind of still that wasn't calm, the kind of still that was control, that required constant maintenance, that had been practiced for so long it looked effortless. Come with me, he said. She should have refused. Every rational instinct she possessed should have been screaming at her to refuse. She was standing on a bridge at midnight with a man who had no heartbeat, who had appeared from nowhere, and he was inviting her to go somewhere with him, and she should have said no. She looked back toward the city, toward the Vasile house with its lit windows and her father's cold assessment and her sister's expression of satisfaction and 23 years of carefully managed invisibility. She turned back. All right, she said. She did not know his name yet. She did not know what he was yet, though she had begun to form hypotheses that her rational mind was not ready to accept. She did not know that the life she had just agreed to walk toward would be the first real one she had ever had. She only knew that his hands had been warm in the dark, and that he had caught her, and that for reasons she could not explain, she trusted the absence of his heartbeat more than she had ever trusted the presence of her family's voices. He brought her to the Veldren court. It occupied the eastern quarter of Caldenmere's old city, a district that the current city maps acknowledged, but that taxi drivers avoided, and that most residents of Caldenmere treated the way people treat the edges of things they don't want to examine. The buildings here were older. The stone was a different color, darker, absorbing rather than reflecting the city's light. The streets ran in patterns that had been laid before the current grid existed. She understood what she was walking into somewhere between the third and fourth block, not because anything announced itself, because her body understood it before her mind did. A pressure in the air that wasn't sound and wasn't temperature, but was something else, something that registered just below the threshold of naming. The pressure of being watched by things that were very old and very patient. His name was Aldric. She learned this from the woman who met them at the door of a building that was either a very large house or a very small palace, depending on how you chose to measure things. The woman was perhaps 60 in appearance and considerably older in the eyes, and she looked at Lena with an expression that was not welcoming, but was not hostile either. It was assessing, the way a doctor assesses, trying to determine what needs to be done. My lord, she said, she needs food, a room, dry clothes. Aldric was already moving past her toward the interior of the house. See to it. Lena registered the shape of the order and the flatness it was delivered in, not commanding in the way of people who needed to remind others of their authority, but commanding in the way of people who had never experienced the alternative. She followed the woman whose name was Sura, through corridors lit by actual candles, dozens of them in brackets, along the walls, and Lena noticed that they did not flicker the way candles flicker in a draft. They were absolutely steady, too steady. She was given a room with a fire that had been lit before she arrived, which meant either that her arrival had been anticipated or that fires were lit in this house as a matter of course, and dry clothes that fit her approximately but not precisely, which meant they had not been prepared for her specifically. She ate what was brought to her without registering the taste of any of it. Her mind was engaged elsewhere, cataloguing, constructing, doing the thing it always did when she was in a situation she didn't understand, building a map of it. She had been found on a bridge by a man with no heartbeat. She had been brought to a house in the old quarter where candles did not move. The woman called him my lord. She was an omega. She had known this about herself since she was 15. which was when the knowledge became useful rather than simply descriptive. She had kept it quiet. The Vasile family would have found uses for it she didn't want to contemplate. But she had known what she was, and she had known what it meant. In the old stories, in the world that sat behind the world, the city pretended was the only one. Omega resonance, the frequency of feeling amplified, the thing that made her suffering audible to the very old, to the very powerful, to the things that should not have been able to hear it at all, to vampires. She sat with this knowledge for a long time by the fire. He knocked before he came in, which she had not expected. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with that same impossible attention, and she noticed again the wrongness of his stillness. Too complete, too absolute, the stillness of something that had not needed to perform calm in a very long time, because calm was simply what it was. "You found the documents," he said. She stilled. "I have people in the city," he said, "in the councils, in the financial offices." He entered the room and took the chair across from her, and she noticed that he sat the way he stood, with a quality of deliberate restraint, as though the furniture required a conscious gentleness that he remembered to apply. "I have been watching Gregor Elas for some time. You are not the first person to find what he has built. You are the first to survive the finding." The fire between them burned absolutely still. "The others," she said, "7, that I know of. The network goes back further." 7, a specific number, not an abstraction. She held it the way you hold something that has weight. 7 people who had found what she found, who had not had a fence to climb or a bridge to run to. "What do you want from me?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes caught the firelight wrong again, that same wrongness, not quite reflection, something that made the light do what it was told rather than what light naturally does. "Nothing," he said. "You are safe here." She had been told things by powerful people before. She had learned to hear the other layer, the thing under the statement. There was no other layer. She was practiced enough at reading the space between what people said and what they meant, to recognize the absence of it. He said she was safe. He meant she was safe. The simplicity of it was almost incomprehensible to her. "Why?" she said. This time the pause before he answered was longer, not a calculating pause, something else. "Your resonance," he said at last. "When I was passing the bridge, I heard it before I saw you. An omega in extremity has a particular frequency. I have heard it before, across a very long time. I have not always been in a position to do something about it." Something shifted in his face that was not quite an expression. "Tonight I was." She looked at the fire. She thought about the word always, about the specific weight it carried when spoken by something as old as he clearly was. "How long have you been in Caldenmere?" she said. 312 years, he said, and the flatness of the delivery was the thing that made it land. Not dramatic, not ornamental, simply factual. The way he reported everything. The fire burned steady between them. She didn't leave. Not that night, not the next. She told herself she was waiting until it was safe to emerge, until she had a plan, until she understood what she had walked into. These were true enough reasons. They were not the whole reason. The whole reason was something she was not ready to look at yet. The fact that for the first time in her memory, she was sleeping a full night through, that she was eating full meals, that the particular tension she carried in her shoulders and her jaw had begun incrementally to loosen, and that the loosening was happening because of the house she was in and not in spite of it. Sura, who managed the house and several other things, with an efficiency that Lena recognized and respected, told her on the 3rd day that the Lord received guests in the morning, and she was welcome to join them or not, as she chose. She joined them. She watched Aldric receive 3 petitioners from the court. She watched the way the room changed when he entered it, not dramatically, not the way it changes for people who need to announce themselves, but quietly. the way a temperature change is felt before it is recognized. He sat at the head of a long table and he listened, and he made decisions that were communicated in the fewest possible words, and that, she noted, were always the right decisions. She could see him being right in real time, watching him account for variables that the petitioners hadn't mentioned and that she had only just noticed herself. He caught her looking at him twice. Both times he did not look away. Both times she was the one who did, and she noticed that too. On the 6th day, she asked Sura for access to the financial records Aldric had mentioned, the evidence he had gathered on Gregor Illis and the network. "The Lord will want to know you've asked," Sura said. "Tell him," Lena said. He brought her the records himself. He set them on the table in front of her and remained standing, and she opened the first file and began to read, and after a moment she heard the chair across from her pull out, and she knew without looking that he had sat down. They worked through the records together over the next 3 days. She had a facility for financial pattern recognition that he lacked and that he did not pretend to possess. He had access to sources she could not have reached, informants in the court, records that did not appear in official filings, the accumulated intelligence of 3 centuries of watching the same structures recycle themselves under different names. The picture that emerged was larger than she had understood from the 6 pages she had found in the quarterly summary. Gregor Illas had not built his network alone. He had 3 partners on the second council, 2 on the third, and a silent facilitator in the Vasile financial offices who had been there for 11 years and whose name Lena recognized immediately, because she had worked beside him every day for the last 4. The 7th victim, the most recent before her, had been an Omega girl of 17 who had worked as a house servant for one of the council partners. She had disappeared 8 months ago. Her case had been listed as a runaway. Lena sat with the file open in front of her and did not move for a long time. "Her name was Petra," Aldric said quietly. She looked at him. "I found her," he said. "I was too late. I will not be too late again." The words were flat. The emotion underneath them was not. She had learned to read the space below his sentences the way she read everything else, precisely without projection, accepting what was there without needing it to be more. What was there under those words was grief, ancient and practiced and still, even after centuries capable of this. She closed the file. "We need the originals," she said, "not copies. The original transfer orders with the original signatures. If we bring copies, the council will argue authentication." "I know where they are," he said. "Then we retrieve them." He was quiet for a moment. "There is danger in the retrieval. The council will be watching the financial offices now. They know you took copies. They will expect you to try for the originals." "I know," she said. "I'm going anyway." He looked at her across the table. The candles in the room were burning very steady. "You are not afraid," he observed. "I'm always afraid," she said. "That's different from not going." He was quiet again. Something in his face did the thing that wasn't quite an expression. "All right," he said, and she understood in the way she had learned to understand him that this was not agreement with her plan. It was something else, recognition perhaps of the kind that does not require further comment. They retrieved the originals. It was not clean or easy or without danger, and there were 3 men in the corridor outside the Vasile financial offices who were not there on legitimate business, and Aldric dealt with them with an efficiency that was not comforting in any ordinary sense, but was, she realized afterward, the thing that had been keeping her safe every day since the bridge. He did not do violence easily. He did it the way he did everything, with deliberate restraint, the minimum required, his predator's nature present and visible and held under absolute control. She found the original documents. They were where he had said they would be. She was not shaking when they left the building. She noticed this with something close to surprise. She had expected to be shaking. Her hands were steady. The part of her that had spent years surviving had finally, somewhere in the retrieval, located something other than survival to run on. The reckoning was held in the Veldren Court's Great Hall, which was large enough to hold the 60 members of Caldenmere's 3 governing councils, plus their advisors and the 12 heads of the city's institutional households. Aldric had summoned them all. He did not explain why. They came because one did not decline a summons from the Veldren Lord, not in 300 years of his residence, not if one wished to continue one's institutional presence in the city. Lena stood at his right hand. She had not expected to stand at his right hand. She had expected to be present, to be witness, to hand over the documents she had spent weeks recovering. He had told her on the morning before the reckoning that she would stand beside him. He had said it the way he said everything, flatly, finally, without explanation. She had not argued. She had understood what it meant, not in the romantic sense, not yet, though she was beginning to understand that too in a way she was not ready to address, but in the structural sense. She was the one who had found the documents. She was the one who had been targeted. She would stand where her standing made what was happening impossible to dismiss. Gregor Elas was brought in by 2 members of Aldric's household. He was a man of perhaps 60, silver-haired, the kind of man who had spent so long inside institutional authority that he had come to wear it as naturally as skin. He looked at the assembled council members with the expression of a man who expected even now to find an exit. He looked at Lena with something else entirely. "This is irregular," he began. "Yes," Aldric said. The single word did what a longer sentence would not have. It removed every scaffold Illis had been building for his response. Aldric did not elaborate. He let the syllable sit in the silence of the hall the way a verdict sits. He presented the documents himself, holding each one up to be seen by the hall before laying it on the table between them. Original signatures, original account numbers. 7 transfers, named, dated, witnessed. He named the co-signatories. He named the council partners. He named the facilitator in the Vasile offices. Each name landed in the hall with the particular weight of things said in front of witnesses who cannot pretend not to have heard. The council's objections came in waves. Aldric answered each of them in the same register. Quiet, precise, exhausting each avenue of argument, before the person arguing it had finished articulating a lit. When Illis tried to suggest that the documents had been fabricated, Aldric produced the chain of custody, 6 additional sources, cross-referenced, in formats that could not have been fabricated simultaneously. When 2 of the named council partners tried to suggest that they had been deceived, Aldric read the specific dates of their co-authorizations aloud, one by one against the dates of the corresponding transfers, and let the arithmetic speak for itself. Then he asked for the blood oath. The hall went very still. A blood oath in the vampiric court was not something demanded lightly. It was the oldest form of binding in the blood law, spoken aloud before witnesses, sealed by the voice and the intention together, and permanent in a way that human contracts were not. Breaking a blood oath meant erasure, not death. Erasure, the slow removal of the oath-breaker from the memory of everyone who had ever known them, the severing of every tie, the absolute elimination of presence from the world they had occupied. It was for people who had built their entire existence on being known and connected and present, the only punishment worse than death. Illas stood in front of 60 witnesses and swore aloud to the full scope of what he had done. Each of his named partners swore in turn. They were stripped of their council positions before the hall dispersed. Their property holdings were inventoried and frozen. Their institutional connections were formally severed. They departed the hall as nothing, not imprisoned, not destroyed, simply nothing, walking out into a city that would already be reforming around their absence. Lena watched them go from Aldric's right hand. She held a deed in her hands, a property deed that Aldric had prepared before the reckoning, transferring to her name a small house in the middle district of Caldenmere, near the river but above the floodline, with a south-facing garden and 3 rooms that were hers alone. She held it in both hands because it was real and it was physical, and she needed to feel the paper under her fingers, to believe that the transformation she had just witnessed was permanent and not something that would be unpicked when no one was watching. She looked down at the deed. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The debt is mine, not yours." She understood what he meant, understood the full weight of what he was declining to make about her gratitude. He was refusing to accept thanks for something he considered an obligation, a centuries-old debt to 7 people who had not had what she had, who had not had a fence to climb or a bridge to run to or someone to catch them. She loved him then. She had been moving toward this for some time, she knew that. But it arrived fully formed in that moment, and she did not look away from it. She did not say it yet. She moved into the house near the river 2 weeks later. She learned her neighborhood by walking it in the early mornings, noting which gardens had been kept and which had gone to seed, and which baker was already open before dawn, and which cats owned which stretches of pavement. She established a practice of financial consultation, her particular skill, her ability to read patterns in numbers that others missed. And within a month she had 3 clients who sent her work weekly. She learned the names of the 7. She researched them independently, spending evenings with historical records Aldric's archive held, constructing in her mind the full scope of what had been done, refusing to let them remain abstract. Petra, Sorin, Mara, Ildiko, Vasile, Roxandra, Caesar. She said their names aloud sometimes in the evening, alone in her south-facing room, not as ritual but as acknowledgement. They existed. They had mattered. Aldric came on Tuesdays. It had not been arranged this way. It had emerged, the way real things emerge, through simple repetition until the repetition becomes the fact. He would appear at the door of the house near the river in the early evening, and she would let him in, and they would sit by the window or at the kitchen table, and he would tell her things about the city that she had begun to need to know, and she would tell him things about the patterns she was finding in her clients' records. And the hours would pass in the specific warmth of a silence between 2 people who did not need to perform anything for each other. She noticed the candles in her house did not flicker on Tuesdays. She noticed the quality of his stillness changed in her kitchen, became not the controlled stillness of the great hall, but something softer, the stillness of a thing that had been tense for a very long time and had found, without expecting to, a place where the tension was not required. She noticed the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking, which was the same way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't looking, which was a kind of sustained attention that had nothing in it of hunger and everything in it of need. On the 6th Tuesday, he told her about the 3 people he had loved before her. He said it in the flat register he used for things that were too important to decorate. He had loved a human woman in the 15th century, a human man 2 centuries later, a third more recently, who had died in a city that no longer existed under that name. He said this the way a soldier reports a position, precisely, without flourish, with the absolute knowledge that the precision was the only form of honesty he could offer. She sat with this knowledge for a long time. "You still risk it," she said, "knowing what it costs." He looked at the window. The candles in the kitchen were burning absolutely steady. "Some things are worth the cost," he said. She took his hand across the table. His fingers were warm. That same deliberate warmth, the warmth of a decision rather than a fact of biology. He did not move. He looked at their hands. He turned his hand over and held hers. That was all. It was everything. She found the clause in the blood law 4 months later. She had been cataloguing Aldric's archive. She had been doing it for weeks, with his permission and her own compulsion, because the archive was a 3-century accumulation of documentation that had been maintained but never organized, and she could not look at unorganized material without wanting to fix it. The clause was in a collection of rulings from the early 19th century, transcribed from an older document that the rulings had referenced. It was called the Vasile clause, which meant nothing in any contemporary language, but which, in the formal structure of the blood law, had a precise and ancient meaning. When a blood law curse had been enacted with the participation of a human who acted in good faith, a human who had not known the full implications of their actions, who had broken something open without understanding what they were breaking, the curse could be permanently sealed. The sealing required a voluntary blood ritual performed by the one whose action had initiated the break. The ritual required their life. It could not be performed by proxy. It could not be performed by anyone else. The blood law in its oldest form made no provision for substitution. She sat with the document in her hands for a long time. She had been the one to retrieve the original documents. She had been the one to hand them to Aldric for use in the reckoning. She had not known, had not been told, had not been able to know, because the clause was in a document 3 levels deep in an uncatalogued archive, that the act of retrieval placed her under blood law as the initiator. She had, in her ignorance, broken open the curse. Illis had known. She understood this immediately, with the same pattern-reading clarity that had made her dangerous to him from the beginning. His final act, before the reckoning, had been to ensure the documents were positioned to be found, to be retrieved, to be used. He had known about the Vasile clause. He had engineered her involvement. His defeat was also his revenge, and the structure of it was the most precise cruelty she had ever encountered. She had delivered justice for Petra and Sorin and Mara, and the others, and in doing so she had signed a document she hadn't known existed. She put the document on the desk. She sat with it for a long time. Then she did what she always did when she had completed her assessment of a situation. She began to plan. She did not tell Aldric immediately. She needed to be certain first, certain there was no other reading of the clause, no other precedent, no argument she had missed. She spent 2 weeks in the archive with the systematic attention she brought to everything. She found 6 historical cases. In 4 of them, the initiator had performed the ritual. In 2 of them, attempts had been made to argue substitution. The blood law had refused. Both individuals who had attempted to argue substitution were among the names in the earliest records of the vampiric court's history. Names that had been present and then were not, with no explanation given. Erasure. She closed the last document. She was not afraid. She examined this fact carefully, the way she examined all facts. She was 23 years old and she had been loved, genuinely for the first time in her life, and she had seen 7 people receive something close to justice, and she had a house near the river and a south-facing garden, and 3 clients who sent her work and a set of names she had learned by heart. She had built something. It was real. It was permanent. No one could take any of it back, not even this. She was not afraid. She was something else, something she needed more time to find the exact word for. She told him on a Tuesday. She placed the documents on the kitchen table between them. The clause, the 6 historical precedents. Her own analysis written out by hand in the notation she used for financial work. Clean and precise and unambiguous. She sat down. She let him read. He read everything without interruption. He was very still, the specific kind of still she had learned to recognize as the stillness of something fighting to maintain control. When he finished, he put the documents down and sat without speaking for a long time. "There is no other reading," he said, "not a question. No, she said, I checked 6 times. The substitution cases. Both failed, the cost was worse. She paused. I won't do that to you. The candles in the kitchen did not move, not even the faintest trembling of a wick. When, he said. She loved him for not asking her not to. She loved him for knowing her well enough to know that asking her not to would be the one thing she could not bear, that it would make her smaller, and she had spent her whole life being made smaller, and he had spent 4 months demonstrating that he understood exactly what that cost. Before the winter solstice, she said, the blood law is most stable at the turning points. It will be permanent, it will hold. He was looking at the table. The 7, he said, it will protect them. Retroactively and forward, she said. The clause is specific. No further network can be built on the same structural foundation. The bloodline curse closes permanently. She paused. Petra, Sorin, Mara, Ildiko, Vasile, Roxandra, Caesar. She said the names the way she always said them, precisely, without decoration. It closes for them. He sat for a long time, then he put his hand over hers on the table and held it and said nothing. She gave him her instructions over the following 3 weeks. She had been making notes. The deed to the house, which she wanted, transferred to a trust for the families of the 7, her client files, with specific recommendations for each, the names of 3 people in the city who had helped her without being asked and whom she wanted acknowledged by name, a list of things in the house that she wanted Sura to have, with explanations of why. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and went through the list, item by item, and he received each instruction in the flat registry of someone who is listening completely. Once in the middle of the 3rd week, she looked up from the notes and found him watching her with his hands very still on the table. I would have carried you for centuries, he said. She understood what it cost him to say it plainly. She understood what it meant in the vocabulary of a man who had buried 3 people he loved before he had learned to stop loving, to offer this without flourish. I know, she said, I would have let you. The ritual was held at the Veldren court on the night of the winter solstice. The great hall was full, not because Aldric had summoned anyone, he had not, but because the old court knew, the way old courts always know, that something was happening that would be permanent, and permanence in the blood law demanded witnesses whether or not witnesses were requested. They lined the walls, they stood in the gallery, they were very quiet. The ritual circle was marked in the centre of the hall in salt and iron ash. The candles were lit, hundreds of them in the wall brackets and on the floor at the circle's edge, and they burned absolutely still. Lena walked to the centre of the circle. She was wearing her own clothes, the good dress she had pressed on the night of Mira's engagement dinner, which she had retrieved from the Vasile house at some point in the preceding months, with the calm efficiency she brought to practical tasks. She had wanted to be wearing something that was hers. She was not shaking. She carried the document, the blood law clause, the original in her own hand now, annotated in the margins with the analysis she had completed and the case references she had found. She had prepared it properly, the way she prepared everything. She had written on the back of the last page in clean small letters, for Petra, for Sorin, for Mara, for Ildiko, for Vasile, for Roxandra, for Caesar. She placed it in the centre of the circle. She looked up. Aldric was standing at the edge of the circle. He was not on the other side of it. He was as close as the salt line permitted, which meant he was close enough that she could see his eyes, that same quality of light doing what it was told. She held his gaze. The instructions are on the desk, she said, in the order I gave them to you. I know, he said. The house goes to the trust. I know. Make sure Sura knows about the... Lena. She stopped. He said her name the way he said the things that were too important to decorate. flat and precise and devastating. I know, he said one more time, final, permanent. The most important promises are the simplest sentences, and this was his. She looked at him for a long moment. The candles burned, the hall was silent. 312 years, she said. Was it worth it? He did not look away. Yes, he said. She turned to face the center of the circle. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke the formal words of the ritual, old words, older than the current blood law, older than the court, words she had memorized with the same precision she brought to everything, did not shake. The witnesses in the gallery were very still. The ritual took her quickly. There was no violence in it, no drama. She was standing, and then she was not standing, and the circle flared once, silver and salt white, the quality of light at the moment of chosen ending, and then it was dark. The curse closed permanently for all 7. Spring came early to Caldenmere that year. The house near the river was still standing. The deed was in the trust, properly executed. The south-facing garden had been tended through the winter by Sora, who had done this without being asked, and the first growth was pushing up through the soil. Small things, tentative, testing whether the ground was ready. Aldric stood in the garden in the early morning. He held the document she had placed at the center of the circle. The salt line had not damaged it. The fire had passed through it and left it whole, which was either a quality of the blood law or of the paper she had used. She had been meticulous about the paper, or of something else that did not have a name. He held it in both hands, on the back of the last page in clean small letters. For Petra, for Sorin, for Mara, for Ildiko, for Vasile, for Roxandra, for Caesar. The garden was beginning to wake. The wrong person was standing in it. He stood there for a long time in the early light. He did not weep. He did not speak. He was simply present in the way that things that have survived everything are present. Absolutely, without alternative, carrying the full weight of what remaining costs. He had carried her from the dark once. He would carry this. The candles in the house, visible through the kitchen window, burned absolutely still. If you made it to the end of this story, I want you to know I have been sitting with Lena for a long time. The moment she said the 7 names aloud, precisely without decoration, like they were people rather than a statistic, that was when I understood what kind of woman she was. That was when I understood the ending too, and why it had to be hers to choose. I'd ask you one thing. If Lena had survived, if the claws had found a way around her, what would she have done with the house near the river? What would the garden have looked like in 10 years? I think about that a lot. Thank you for listening to every minute of this. It means something real.